Buenas tardes a todas y a todos. Muchas gracias por venir a estas horas a veces tan cercanas a la post-comida y bueno, agradecidos de que estéis aquí. En esta ocasión os voy a hablar como director del grupo de investigación INDETEHI HISMECOM, que es investigación de temas históricos, historia y memoria contemporánea. Damos comienzo a una práctica habitual que teníamos hasta el año pasado dentro de nuestro grupo de investigación, que es un ciclo que se desarrollará durante todo el curso actual, que son conferencias de actualización científica y de transferencia. Estas conferencias tienen que ver con nuestras disciplinas, con las disciplinas que investigamos en nuestro grupo de investigación, que están relacionadas sobre todo, no solo, pero sobre todo con la historia contemporánea y la historia moderna. En este caso, la conferencia que tenemos hoy, tengo que agradecer a la profesora Marta Sofía López, que está a mi derecha, que nos ha facilitado que una profesora de la Universidad de Capadocia, en Turquía, Hümeyra Tüfek Parlak, pues esté hoy con nosotros. Porque la temática se presta mucho a las cuestiones que investigamos en nuestro grupo de investigación y también porque es un tema de rabiosa actualidad. Antes de centrarme un poco en un breve comentario, después la presentación, digamos, del currículo, de datos curriculares de Hümeyra, lo hará Marta Sofía. Simplemente comentar o avanzar aquí ya antes de que se me olvide que tenemos ya una próxima conferencia y esta conferencia en la cual el conferenciante lo presentará uno de los miembros del equipo de investigación, que es Javier Casado, que también se encuentra aquí presente. Pues la próxima conferencia será el lunes 14 de octubre a las 12 de la mañana, lo avisaremos convenientemente, pero ya estáis avisados, en este mismo Aula Magna, aquí en interese, una conferencia titulada Más allá del objeto, el potencial de la arqueología para el estudio del conflicto contemporáneo. Y estará a cargo del investigador Gorka Martín Echeverría. Repito, el lunes 14 a las 12 de la mañana. A continuación, tengo el gusto de dar paso a esta conferencia que va a pronunciar la profesora Hümeyra Tüfek, titulada, que lleva por título Argumentos, políticos y sociales de la crisis de los refugiados en Turquía. Transformación del sujeto a objeto durante la crisis económica y debates identitarios. Bien, si bien es una cuestión que ya localiza en un espacio geográfico, en este caso, como es Turquía, una entrada también a Europa, lo podemos extrapolar a cualquier otro punto del mundo. Porque a veces somos demasiado eurocéntricos y para eso recomiendo que también ustedes asistan quien quiera, yo les tengo también abierto, al congreso del martes-miércoles que dirige Marta Sofía, que realmente ha tenido un acierto. Yo creo que si ven el cartel, me parece un acierto como del mapa mundi, ¿no? Como realmente le da la vuelta al mapa. Entonces Europa ya no está arriba, sino que quien está arriba es África, ¿no? Me ha parecido muy ilustrativo de lo que ellos quieren comentar en ese congreso, que seguramente ella también comentará ahora. Creo que es un tema de mucha actualidad, repito, porque si desconocemos realmente la problemática de los refugiados, de las personas que vienen de otros países, de otros continentes, pues tenemos mucha menos capacidad para enjuiciar y para emitir nuestra opinión. Solamente quiero recordar que ayer en la isla de Hierro han fallecido cerca del medio centenar de personas. Me parece que son 48 personas que lo único que buscan es a veces salir de sus países porque son perseguidos por sus ideales políticos, ideológicos, religiosos, de género, y otras veces son fruto también de conflictos armados. Es una cuestión que tenemos que tener bien clara. Evidentemente también hay un componente de refugiados económicos. Tenemos una problemática, pero lo tenemos que hacer mirar, creo que tenemos que tener los ojos bien abiertos, las orejas muy amplias en este sentido, porque también quiero recordar que ayer en unas elecciones celebradas en un país centroeuropeo, en Austria, ha ganado la ultraderecha. Con lo cual la ultraderecha realmente está en contra, o sea, viola los derechos humanos y evidentemente son sus ideales. Evidentemente está en contra de esas personas que realmente solo buscan, bueno, pues salvar su vida a veces y otras veces mejorar su situación. Creo que tenemos que tener, bueno, un concepto amplio de las cosas, escuchar a la profesora Hümeyra y después nosotros también, bueno, tener nuestra propia opinión sobre el tema. De eso también es de lo que van las conferencias del grupo de investigación INDETEHI HISMECOM. Temas amplios de diferentes cuestiones de historiográficas, pero que realmente susciten el interés para que todos estemos, bueno, mucho más formados en ese sentido. Con lo cual, muchas gracias. Yo doy paso ya a María Sofía, a la que le agradezco profundamente el que, gracias a ella, hayamos podido contar con la presencia de Hümeyra Tüfek.
Yes.
Okay. Muy bien, muchas gracias.
En realidad soy yo quien tiene que dar las gracias al decano, porque yo le hice esta propuesta y él inmediatamente pues, la aceptó de muy buen grado. Debo deciros, yo el año pasado, yo hace muy poco que descubrí que los profes también teníamos Erasmus, porque yo estoy en el mundo porque hay sitio. Y de repente pues vi que había Erasmus para profes. Fui 2 años seguidos a Senegal, porque yo soy africanista, y bueno, pues el seminario, las jornadas que empezamos mañana, pues tienen mucho que ver, ¿no?, con mi trayectoria de más de 30 años como africanista y afroeuropeísta, ¿no?, que es de lo que van un poco las jornadas, sobre qué son, cómo se configuran las identidades afroeuropeas. En todo caso, después de 2 años en Senegal, me apetecía ir a Turquía, entre otras cosas porque la Universidad de Capadocia tiene un centro de estudio de humanidades medioambientales que es realmente de referencia a nivel mundial. Creo, y es evidente, ¿no?, que uno de los problemas más graves que tiene este planeta es pues, que hemos absolutamente destrozado nuestra relación con eso que llamamos el medio ambiente, ¿no?, como si fuera una cosa ajena a nosotros y a nosotras y a nosotres. Pues no, la mayor parte de las sociedades tradicionales y medianamente civilizadas, y no como la nuestra, entienden que los seres humanos somos una parte de un todo cósmico sagrado, y que a menos que recuperemos esa relación con eso, esa cosa que llamamos medio ambiente, pues el planeta va muy mal, y va muy mal también en términos, pues eso, de generar oleadas inmensas de refugiados debidas a hambrunas, a guerras, a conflictos, bueno, y verdaderamente estamos empezando a tener cada vez más también refugiados climáticos, y habrá más en las próximas décadas. En todo caso, debo deciros que flipé con Turquía. Yo conocía Túnez, Marruecos, Egipto. Turquía me pareció diferente a todo. Os aconsejo una estancia Erasmus en Turquía. Aparte de que la Capadocia es divina, te montes o no en globo, la Capadocia es una preciosidad. Pero también la Universidad de Capadocia es una universidad muy centrada en ese entorno geopolítico, económico, paisajístico, histórico particular. Yo iba, como siempre que voy a los sitios, bueno, ignorándolo casi todo. Lo poquito que he ido aprendiendo de Turquía y de su historia y del Imperio Otomano, pues me ha dejado bastante loca, porque claro, cuando en Europa, en el 90% de Europa, éramos unos auténticos gañanes, bueno, pues ya por otras latitudes había culturas, civilizaciones, regímenes políticos infinitamente más, en fin, articulados o avanzados, si queremos. Lo que pasa es que a mí no me gusta hablar en términos de avance o retroceso, más que nada porque tampoco creo mucho en la idea del tiempo lineal. Anyway, había sistemas socioculturales y políticos infinitamente más refinados que lo que teníamos en Occidente. Bueno, pues a partir de la época de las grandes expansiones, ¿no?, primero pues imperialistas, luego colonialistas, hemos pretendido homogeneizar el mundo, ¿no? Eso que dice Miñolo con el título de uno de sus libros, historias locales con voluntad de expansión global, ¿no? Local Histories, Global Designs. Afortunadamente hemos conseguido colonizar bastante menos de lo que creemos al resto del planeta. Hay muchas sociedades que reexisten, resisten y, como dijo un conocido, resisten. Ir a Turquía o estar en Turquía significa ubicarse de repente en absolutamente otro horizonte geopolítico y en otro eje y en otra atalaya para contemplar la realidad. Pensad que, pues eso, en el Imperio Otomano abarcó pues todo lo que ahora llamamos Oriente Medio, parte de la China, es decir, fue un pedazo de imperio. Ayer estábamos haciendo la broma que si cualquier turca se hace la prueba de ADN, puede tener de todo en su sangre, porque Turquía ha sido el gran cruce de caminos entre eso que arbitrariamente, muy arbitrariamente, hemos llamado Oriente y Occidente. Pensad que esa división y que esa presuposición, ¿no?, que tenemos acerca de que el mapa mundi, representa la realidad, pues es solamente una ilusión. No existen ni el norte, ni el sur, ni Oriente, ni Occidente. Todo depende de eso, de quién de repente dibuja el mapa, y dibujar un mapa evidentemente es un acto de entrada imperialista, y es un acto que pueden llevar a cabo quienes tienen el poder de definir al resto del mundo. Va siendo hora de que nos bajemos, ¿no?, de nuestro pedestal de eurocentrismo paleto, ignorante y radicalmente ciego a la cantidad de pluriversos y de modernidades que conviven en este planeta, y por eso me parece especialmente interesante tener la posibilidad de escuchar la visión de un asunto, la crisis de los refugiados en Turquía, que por supuesto también afecta a la Unión Europea. Desde mi humilde perspectiva, Hümeyra puede desarrollar eso, los europeos, o sea, Europa, la Unión Europea está siendo magníficamente cínica, hipócrita y perversa. Por un lado, animando a Turquía a, entre comillas, modernizarse, que ni puñetera falta le hace. O sea, Turquía es un país muy moderno en los términos en los que en Occidente entendemos la modernidad, que son también muy debatibles, pero al mismo tiempo con capas y capas y capas de historia. O sea, y pensad eso, el Imperio Bizantino, el Imperio Otomano, todos los cruces de caminos, en fin. Entonces creo que es muy bueno poder ver un tema como es el de los refugiados, en el que la Unión Europea está por un lado diciendo a los turcos modernizados, pero por otro lado les está poniendo las cosas cada vez más difíciles para entrar en la Unión Europea, por la sencilla razón de que Turquía, igual que Marruecos o que Mauritania o que tantos otros países, están funcionando como la frontera externa de la Unión Europea. Entonces nos viene estupendamente pues que Turquía asuma, ¿no?, ese movimiento masivo de sirios que se ha generado a partir de la guerra en Siria, pero por Dios que no sean europeos, no vaya a ser que de repente nos lleguen y nos quiten el trabajo y nos quiten el pan y nos quiten, en fin, todas esas cosas que está pregonando la extrema derecha, y preocupantemente a nivel global. Quiero decir que desde Milei en Argentina hasta, en fin, estamos en una época política, yo creo que sumamente periculosa, porque nos hemos olvidado de algo tan humano como es el que todas las personas tenemos exactamente la misma dignidad, derechos, y deberíamos tener la capacidad de poder vivir, existir, cada cultura dentro de sus parámetros y todo el mundo en paz. Bueno, yo soy un poco hippie y un poco eso, make love not war, ¿vale? En todo caso, la profesora Hümeyra Tüfek da clase en la Universidad de Capadocia, estudió en la Universidad Sultan Mehmet Akif University, supongo que lo habré pronunciado con el culo, pero bueno, no tengo todavía mucho nivel en turco, o sea, ninguno. Lleva allí 2 años trabajando, específicamente ya enseña la historia de Atatürk. Supongo que para la gente de historia sois conscientes, ¿no?, de que Atatürk fue el gran revolucionario, el gran héroe nacional que de alguna forma eso impuso la modernización de Turquía. Debo decir que el día que yo llegué a Ürgüp, al pueblo en el que me estaba quedando para este intercambio Erasmus, pues era la fiesta de Atatürk, y claro, en España ya como que estamos poco acostumbrados, bueno, excepto eso, una manada de descerebrados, ¿no? Que salen por ahí con la bandera a rezar rosarios y esas cosas, pues estamos poco acostumbrados a las manifestaciones nacionalistas, excepto pues en el caso a lo mejor eso, de que juegue la selección. Bueno, pues yo llegué a Ürgüp, era el día de Ataturk y estaba absolutamente todo el pueblo ondeando la bandera nacional, cantando himnos nacionales, con fuegos artificiales rojos. A mí me sorprendió, ¿no? Ese derroche, digamos, de conciencia nacional. Bueno, pues esa conciencia nacional arraiga en Ataturk, que es, bueno, pues el político, el legislador, gobernante, que transformó el Imperio Otomano pues en otra cosa que ahora es Turquía. Por lo demás, ha publicado pues muchas cosas sobre historia turca. Por ejemplo, un artículo estoy viendo que me resulta de lo más interesante, de Rothschild and the Ottoman Empire, o sea, la familia Rothschild, que sabéis que siguen siendo parte del bendito club Bilderberg, de la gente que mueve el mundo. Mujeres de Bizancio, Bizancio y Roma, pero también cosas más contemporáneas como, bueno, la Guerra Fría y cuál fue la posición de Turquía primero en las guerras y luego en la Guerra Fría. En fin, creo que para la gente de historia pues va a resultar sumamente interesante lo que nos va a contar, pero no solo para la de historia, porque no es por nada, pero todos vivimos, ¿no? Y vamos en el mismo barco. Y es, bueno, nuestro deber, creo, como personas, se presupone, ¿no? Que si estamos en una universidad somos personas con un cierto nivel de inteligencia y una cierta ambición intelectual. Y esa ambición intelectual y esa inteligencia tiene que dar paso a una curiosidad por lo que ocurre más allá de, en fin, nuestros ombligos blancos y europeos y eurocéntricos o euroamericanos. Así que pues es un placer presentar a Hümeyra Tüfek, que nos contará, nos va a dar su visión de lo que está suponiendo en Turquía la crisis de los refugiados desde el estallido de la guerra en Siria, que, bueno, como bien sabéis, pues tiene mucho que ver también con los manejos, ¿no?, de Estados Unidos y sus 50 mejores amigos. Hümeyra.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm really happy to be here. We are talking about political and social arguments of the refugee crisis in Turkey, transforming from subject to object during economic crisis and identity debates. As we all know, the ongoing civil war and conflict in Syria since 2011 has led to the emergence of new approaches and policies towards refugees in many countries around the world. Today, we will discuss the social and economic effects of this ongoing refugee policy in Turkey. In fact, examining this issue under several headings and with fundamental distinctions will allow us to perceive Turkey's position on the refugee problem more systematically. The first of this is, of course, the policies of the AKP government, which has been in power since the beginning of the refugee flow, regarding the region and the refugee acceptance agreements they have signed internationally. Another is understanding the burden these policies have created on Turkey, together with the budget allocated for Syrians combined with the economic crisis. The third is the anti-Syrian discourse and increasing nationalism they have spread to the base of society like a groundswell of all these problems. Turkey has been hosting an increasing number of refugees since the first influx of migration from Syria began in 2011. While the status of refugees are thought to be temporary, it is seen that the perspective and the policy towards refugees in Turkey were quite understanding and tolerant in the first few years. However, the long duration of the war in Syria, Turkey's Syria policies, and the ongoing cross-border struggles with terrorist organizations such as the YPG have shown that migration that has increased in a short time is not short-term. That deepening economic crisis and unbearable inflation experienced as of 2018 have further fueled social anger and discrimination language. Anatolia is a region that has hosted many societies throughout history due to both its geographical location and its historical and cultural importance. Since the Republic of Turkey was founded as a nation-state in 1923, it has also received a large number of migration from the territories of former Ottoman Empire. However, when compared to the migration that took place in 2011 and after, it is seen that previous migration were regular and controllable. Therefore, a few questions need to be asked here. What caused this wave of migration starting from Syria to become more intense than previous migrations? What will be the status of Syrians? Are the policies successful? How did Turkish society view these migrations? Of course, the result of all this have led to the changes at the political, economic, and social levels. The first group of 252 refugees entering Turkey from Syria set foot on the Turkish soil through the Cilvegöz border gate on April 29, 2011. At the time, the Syrian civil war had just begun, and the government was pursuing an open-the-door policy against those trying to enter Turkish territory through the border, and refugees were defined as guests who stayed in Turkey until the end of the war. While the AKP government continued its current open-door policy, it frequently used religious and emotional motives instead of rational relevant provisions of international law in order to convince the society about the incoming migration waves. The concept of Ensar-ı Muhacir, which is an Islamic reference to religious brotherhood, was the most frequently heart of these motives. However, the AKP's government refugee policy soon revealed unforeseen problems. The first of these was the mistake in predicting the high cost of the economic incoming refugees. The leaders thought they could quickly defeat the Syrian government, but they were wrong. This mistake caused big problems. Indeed, when the number of refugees increased more rapidly than expected, Turkey made changes in its legal regulation and tried to make its current system capable of coping with the new challenge. In this context, by enacting the Law on Foreign and International Protection in April 2013 and preparing the Temporary Protection Regulation in October 2014, Syrian refugees in Turkey were placed under temporary protection and were provided with a legal status where they can benefit from fundamental rights. Another important issue is that the period when the refugee crisis was at its most intense coincided with the AKP's process of rebuilding of the concept of Westernism in Turkish politics. While Turkey was portrayed in the AKP's discourse as a country that implemented an open-door policy and provided all kinds of assistance of refugees and pursued humanitarian policies, European countries were accused of being crushed under the heavy weight of racist populism, and they closed their doors to refugees. Therefore, the images of us and the other were stratified through discourse. Thus, the refugee issue ceased to be only an important domestic policy issue, but also became a tool in foreign policy. At this point, the government's inconsistent statements regarding refugees should also be underlined. In this context, sometimes refugees were promised Turkish citizenships, while in other cases it was emphasized that refugees could cross into Europe to return to their countries. Indeed, they were allowed to cross into Greece in February-March 2020. In a speech on September 5, 2019, President Erdogan stated that Turkey wanted to be established as a safe zone in Syria, but if this did not happen, Turkey might have to open the doors. Indeed, starting from February 28, 2020, for approximately 2 weeks, Turkey allowed refugees to cross the Pazargüle border gate, which is at the Greek border, and this situation showed how the threat at opening the gates, occasionally voiced against European countries, can be quickly put into practice. Therefore, the refugee policy of the AKP elites is far from being consistent and can be structured differently every day in the context of current political interest. For example, on March 2nd, 2020, when the gates were open at the border, President Erdogan said, "The European Union is still applying double standards today, whereas the fair share of burdens and the responsibilities. Are we going to carry this burden?" Expressing the change in the government's policy and criticizing the European Union for not opening its borders to refugees. The contradiction in the government's rhetoric and policies towards Syrian refugees are not limited to this. The discourses such as guests, our brothers or our sisters, and Ansar Muhajir in the early years of the migration movement have disappeared over time, and the increase in critical discourse towards refugees in the public opinion, especially AKP lost the local election in big cities in the 2019 elections. These losses have been reflected in the government's discourse and practices. The wave of migrations that Turkey has experienced since 2011 is, in some ways, very different from previous waves. Due to this migration from Syrian refugees, Turkey has become the country hosting the most refugees in the world, overtaking Pakistan's records since 2014. At this point, Turkey does not legally recognize people fleeing the war in Syria and taking refuge in its country as refugees, but defines them persons under temporary protection. Despite this, the concept of refugee we used in this study taken into account the actual situation. In this context, according to the figures of the General Director of Migration Management, as of September 2022, around 4 million Syrians live in Turkey under temporary protection. However, unregistered refugees are not included in this figure. When they are taken into account, it is obvious that the real number of refugees is higher than the official figures. In this context, the number of refugees who reached Turkey between 2011 and 2022, in other words, in the last 11 years, is higher than the number of refugees who arrived between 1923 and 2010, in other words, in 87 years. Another issue related to the refugee problem is to show themselves in social and economic areas. In 20 years, with the addition of 4 million Syrians and 2 million refugees from Iraq, Afghanistan, Iran, and other countries, this number has increased to 6 million. The population data obtained with all these facts is that Arabic-speaking people now constitute the second largest minority in Turkey after the Kurdish-speaking making up 7% of the country's population. Since the vast majority of refugees are concentrated in large cities where they live side by side with Turkish citizens, it is difficult for Turkish society to ignore this new reality. In order to limit the number of refugees in each province and reduce social tensions between refugees and citizens, the government has developed a provincial protection system requiring refugees to register with local municipalities in the city where they are settled. According to the system, refugees can only benefit from the services and rights in the cities where they are registered and must obtain permission for intercity travel. However, many refugees find it difficult to live and work in the places where they are settled and are flocking in large cities such as Istanbul and Izmir, where they can find work and start businesses, mostly in informal economy. Istanbul, Turkey's largest city with a population of 50 million, officially hosts more than 500,000 Syrian refugees. The number is even higher when unregistered refugees are included. The economic burden of hosting so many refugees is quite heavy for Turkey. Some experts estimate that Ankara has spent 100 billion on housing, medical care, and education for Syrian refugees in the past decade. The European Union, Turkey's largest provider of refugee aid, gave the country 6 billion euros between 2016 and 2019 and has promised another 3 billion euros for 2021 and 2024, but these amounts only cover a fraction of Turkey's needs. Many refugees in Turkey are employed, but their contribution to the Turkish economy is mixed. While there are no official figures on refugee employment, survey data suggests that only about half of the 2 million adult Syrian refugees in Turkey are employed, and almost all of them work informally. The Turkish government began guaranteeing work permits to Syrians in 2016, but according to the latest government figures, only 35,000 had work permits as of 2019. According to the International Labour Organization 2020 estimate, 97% of refugees in Turkey work informally, partly due to the barriers such as language, and partly due to the Turkish government's quota system, which limits the number of refugees employed in a given workplace to 10% of the total staff. Turkey's informal economy has expanded significantly. These expansions of the informal economy creates unsafe and often precarious conditions for workers. Education of refugees is another big issue. The Turkish government reported in January 2022 that there were 1.1 million Syrian children of school age in Turkey, with around 730,000 of them enrolled in school. That means that around 400,000 Syrian children, or 35% of them, remain outside the education system. This work and education problems stem from a lack in infrastructure and a lack of current government policy on the refugee issue. Some experts say that Turkey has been changing its migration policies often and without a clear plan. These policies, like work permits and citizenship, are confusing and inconsistent. The government often makes quick decisions to solve problems with refugees instead of creating long-term plans to help them integrate into society. Some experts believe that Turkey's refugee policies are not due to competitions, but are instead a deliberate strategy. They argue that the government is using refugees as a cheap labor, blaming them for domestic problems, and using them for political gain in international relations. In the early years of the Syrian civil war, which began in 2011, the Turkish public seemed to welcome refugees. However, this picture has changed dramatically since then. In August 2021, Survey by the research company Metropol, 67% of respondents said that Turkey should completely close its border to refugees. A March 2022 survey by the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees found that 48% of Turkish citizens wanted the government to send Syrian refugees back to Syria. There is a fourfold increase in the number of people who share this view compared to the 3 years ago. Most Turkish citizens, including those who support the opposition and those with nationalist views, are worried about the number of refugees in Turkey. Many people want the government to send refugees back home or keep them in refugee camps. This decline in public support for refugees is largely due to the economic crisis that has been ongoing in Turkey since 2017, which have caused unprecedented hyperinflation and unemployment, as well as rising income inequality, poverty, and hunger. Other factors that have influenced public opinion include the influx of Afghan refugees following the US withdrawal from Afghanistan in 2021, and the growing belief that the refugees will never leave Turkey. The most significant divide between refugees and Turkish citizens appears to stem from cultural differences, especially linguistic and religious differences. The Turkish language is a fundamental element of Turkish nationalism. It is therefore not surprising that Turkish citizens often cite the proliferation and Arabic signs, songs in cities like Istanbul and Izmir as a major problem for social harmony. Many secular Turkish citizens also describe the overt religiosity of some Syrian and Afghan refugees as a threat to their way of life and even security threat. Disinformation on social media has both capitalized on a fluid, negative public perception of refugees in an environment of ever-increasing unemployment and inflation. Much of the most widely circulate false claims about Syrian refugees online have focused on the refugees' presumed guilt and economic advantages they have gained. Social media posts claim, for example, that Syrians have attacked Turkish citizens, taken their jobs and homes, refused to rent them to Turkish speakers, failed to pay their bills or taxes, and the government has provided them with various grants and unfair benefits. Media outlets often fund the flames with provocative headlines. Last year, a Turkish newspaper called Sözcü reported false information about the impact of Syrian refugees on Turkey's economy. They said that for every 10 Syrian refugees, 6 Turkish people lost their jobs. This was not true. Not only online campaigns and the media spread false information about refugees, opposition politicians also use this false information to scare people and get votes. They claim that President Erdogan gave citizenship to refugees before the election to get more votes. During their campaigns in the 2019 elections, politicians claimed that Syrian voters were being kept waiting to ensure Erdogan and his party won certain districts and that they could pose a threat to election security. These claims were widely reported in mainstream media and online. Despite the fact that less than half of Syrian refugees in Turkey were eligible to vote at the time. Rising anti-refugee sentiment escalated into violence in 2017 A group of the 300 people reportedly attacked refugees in a neighborhood in Izmir, forcing 500 of them flee the area. In July 2019, an unconfirmed report of Syrian refugees committing sexual violence against children in a neighborhood of Istanbul led to the wave of violence, with homes and workplaces being stoned. In August 2021, a mass group attacked and vandalized shops belonging to refugees in a neighborhood in Ankara, and the man told reporters who spoke to them, "These people don't pay any taxes." The public's increasing negative attitude towards refugees has become a real political crisis for the country. According to recent polls, many voters see refugees as Turkey's second most important problem after the economy. Indeed, opposition parties say that they receive the most applause when they bring up the refugee issue in their election speeches. Many political analysts attribute the major opposition party, Cumhuriyet Halk Partisi, the Republican People's Party, CHP, to its big victory in the 2019 municipal elections, to its promise to send refugees back during the election campaign. This apparent anti-refugee sentiment among voters had led most political parties to harden their stance on migration, and even led to emergency of openly anti-refugee parties. The founding doctrine of one political party appears to be entirely anti-immigrant rhetoric focused on Turkish nationalism. While anti-immigrant sentiment is growing in Turkey, social media is especially affecting the young and middle-aged masses. Immigration, especially from Muslim countries, creates some concerns among the secular segment in Turkey. The biggest reason for this concern is the conservative structure of the AKP, which has been in power in Turkey for 22 years, and the fact that political Islam has become an official language. In addition, the far-right tendencies that have increased their influence with the immigration in a certain segment of society and the pro-Sharia discourses are increasing the polarization between different bases in society. Therefore, politics in Turkey today has become a concern that occupies every segment of society in daily life. After economic problems, the refugee crisis is seen as the biggest problem in politics. The influx of migrants that began in 2011 via Syria reached 6 million in the following years, with migration from different Islamic countries. The policy and political language pursued by the AKP government towards migrants have changed many times over time. The increase in economic expenditures required for refugees and the rising inflation in Turkey have directly affected social concerns. The increase in crime rates, fatal cases, and rape cases has brought xenophobia to even more serious levels. On the other hand, a large portion of the refugees have neither learned the language nor integrated into society, especially when the rapidly increasing birth rates of refugees and the decreasing birth rates of Turks are considered. It has also brought about future population and identity discussions. Refugees and those who settle among them have remained the order of society, including in their areas of citizenship. Despite Turkey mobilizing all the means and aid it can, the economic crisis, increasing social discontent, population and identity concerns have become politically unsolvable. All these problems have turned Turkey into a refugee depot, stuck between the East and the West. But the open door policy and the irregular migration it pursued, as well as the refugee problems experienced in Europe, were effective in this. Language also became problematic with these unforeseen difficulties, and especially in political terms, refugees become a bargaining tool and turned from subject into an object. Thank you for listening, but I can show you some images on the PowerPoint. You can see here Cilvegözü border gate and coming refugees in there. Where is Cilvegözü border gate? In Hatay, Turkey. Other means Antioquia. You can see here. Here, Hatay in Antioquia, and this land, Syria. This is Turkish map.
Muy útil para vuestras clases de geografía.
Geography is important. And you can also refugee camps. We have so many in this, like this. And Pazarkule border gate. It's important for Europe, actually. You can see here Edirne and that line, Pazarkule border crossing, neighborhoods, Bulgaria and Greece. This is big view. You can see Europe and Turkey. And another picture, Pazarkule border gate. Refugees waiting to cross into Europe in the winter. Arabic signs being torn by Turkish officers. This is one example. We have many pictures like this. Thank you for listening.